Hello everyone, am I audible? There we are. Alright, so as you can see, we are going through... I never know how to pronounce this guy's name. What if Altist? What if Altist? For anyone who's not familiar with this guy, he does alt history videos, but not just alt history videos, also some very much, at least attempts at real history. And I think the guy's like an undergraduate, so I don't want to be too mean here. I might even revise the title of this video just because I don't like the idea of going this harsh on a kid. But they leave much to be desired. I think I'm going into this particular video blind, but I think we'll see why in fairly short order, because he's pretty consistent in that he's very willing to use cliches to make massive jumps, not just through time, but also to conclusions. So we're going to be going through this. Thank God it's only about 18 minutes and 22 seconds. And we'll, I mean, just from the title, you know this is going to be bad. Why the right and left hate each other. So I'm going to make some predictions before I go in. I've seen people mention in chats that he makes heavy use of Jonathan Haidt here. It's been a long time, but Jonathan Haidt, he's a moron, basically. So, Jonathan Haidt operates in this kind of centrist space where you think it's a profound stance to treat right and left as simply you know, dual parts of an essential human political I don't want to say nature, but like these are two different extremes of qualities that we all have in some measure. So there are people on the left who have just like an abundance of openness and whatnot, but they lack like a concern for tradition and, you know, like a healthy skepticism about our ability to chart the course of the future consciously, our ability to manipulate our destiny, things like that. Whereas on the conservative end, there's a lack of openness, and they have these positive qualities of being, you know, having a healthy degree of prudence and caution, which I think is not predicable of the right specifically, but I think it's a those are positive traits in their place. And basically the idea is that these two sides, they're just two halves of they're two extreme ends of an otherwise healthy individual who would approach every situation in a more balanced way, and that's where the enlightened centrist stance conceives of itself as sitting. What it actually does is it takes the most ideologically biased stance possible by taking that specific construal of the political divisions in a place and treating it as simply natural. It's no longer a contingent part of history. It is simply something that is there. It's not a thing. It's far less it's basically conservatism with no self-awareness. So conservatism understands its position as being the tenuous result of history. A radical conservative or even a reactionary tries to consciously push a particular time and place. Well, I say consciously, but I should say like to some degree of consciousness. Tries to advocate for the conditions of a specific time and place. Whereas somebody who treats that specific the time and place in which they currently exist as being how should I put this? Somebody who treats the categories that are appropriate to the time and place in which one finds oneself as simply given, as simply natural. That person can't even conceive of these things as being themselves part of an ideological stance. And so they're actually, in fact, the most ardent conservatives. They just don't realize it. That was worded badly, but maybe it'll become clear as we go through. So where Haidt comes into this is he tries to he tries to ask, okay, why there's decent, serious people on both sides, quote unquote. Um, how do they end up being at such vicious odds with one another? And so that's what The Righteous Mind is about. I take him to be making use of that book in some respect, but we'll see more of that when we get into it, I think. Let me just double check to make sure the audio is working here just fine. Even amongst the broader left, there is so much tension and friction. Yeah, so one of the major problems with this construal as right and left is simply given, of them simply reflecting human tendencies, is that it takes away the specificity. It takes away the specific issues around which they formed. People may indeed find themselves drifting in early life to the right or the left, as it's depicted on television based on personal dispositions, but actual right and left-wing causes are not based on those at all. They're based on very practical, historically contingent contentions. Extending or even creating certain, or I should rather say enshrining certain legal rights. Particular conceptions of the health of the state, whether or not there should be an allowance for certain ideas or even certain groups within the territory of the state. Like these aren't reflective of human tendencies. These are reflective of real material disagreements. So to characterize stances on these things as simply differences of temperament, ultimately, that is an effect to basically enshrine the status quo as being, regardless of whatever token gesture you might make towards there being like still inequality or still racism or what have you. That amounts in the end to enshrining the status quo as essentially as good as it can get, as essentially the thing that we need to protect. And people who take extreme stances vis-a-vis that as being simply unwell in some respect, as being in need of counseling, being in need of being put into their place. And as it so happens, the conservatives would always end up being put into the place of, you know, the leaders, and the the leftists, whatever those are simply the, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, it's like a philosophy is the queen of the sciences or something like that. They're the muse of our institutional leaders. They're the ones who, you know, they prod them and they agitate them and they make them think outside the box and stuff like that. Ultimately, they're just custodians, or not custodians. They're they're like an advisory role. You know, leaving aside the fact that the left wing itself, again, whatever that refers to, because while the right wing coalesces around a very small amount of specific policy positions, the left wing is basically just defined as everything the right is opposed to. And so you actually, when you hear like the meme about the left eating its own and things like that, well, not really. You're talking about a tiny political cult on the one hand, being the right wing, and basically everybody else, and all sorts of disputes about everything else outside. Like, what does the left wing include? The left wing includes trans rights activists, TERFs. It includes communists. It includes SOCDEMs. It even includes sometimes liberals. You're talking about so many different groups. Of course, there's going to be disputes among them. To talk about the left, I mean, I think Haidt even talks about the left as being equivalent in some respect with liberalism, or as being like the left is liberalism as being a sort of a low degree of extremeness, or a low concentration of leftness, if you will, something like that. People who are slightly left are liberals, people who are more left are communists, etc., which is patently ridiculous. But anyways, enough of me blabbering. We're going to go through this, and we're going to see how bad this thing is. Alright, let's do this.
The struggle between the right and the left is central to almost every country in the West right now. It's so central, in fact, that it often shocks me. Really, we're arguing over what to call Christmas or transgender bathrooms when climate change could make Florida sink or China's trying to take over Asia. However, once you dig a little, you find that rather than...
Is there a debate over what to call transgender bathrooms? I don't know what a transgender bathroom is anyways. I'm pretty sure most of the disputes over bathrooms have to do with making bathrooms gender neutral. Or making, cultivating attitudes where trans people aren't treated poorly when they go into a bathroom of their avowed sex or gender. I should say avowed gender, I think. I'll have to think about that one.
Than just being a political conflict, the struggle between the right and the left is central to modern Western civilization, with ideological roots going back thousands of years, and with whichever side wins being decisive for the future.
Okay, so he says ideological roots, so obviously the formal division between right and left goes back at the earliest to the French Revolution. If he's talking about a general tendency towards widening social rights and, general move towards more and more democratization, things like that, there would be something of a point there. Unless he's going back to Cleisthenes, though, or to Solon, then this is nonsensical. It's certainly not central to civilization generally. Again, whatever that's taken to mean. I don't particularly like the term civilization because I think it's somewhat fuzzy. I think it's very fuzzy. But this is setting up red flags. I don't, and this is something else. The right and left, going back thousands of years. The right wing, post-French Revolution, like in the 20th century, say. The right wing does not simply refer to a conservative tendency that you can trace back thousands of years. Fascists are revolutionaries no less than Marxists are in many respects. They're still attempting to push against a lot of the same material forces, a lot of the same inhuman material forces, albeit they center the state and a certain conception of the human will as opposed to the establishment of a universal class. And we've seen the cruel results of that, which is not to say, again, that avowedly socialist states can't also be cruel. But the point is, there is no essential conservative spirit within the right. To assume that the right and the left simply refer to, again, openness and closedness in various forms is preposterous. By the way, some of the most conservative people I have known have been trans leftists.
This video will look at why and how the right and the left are different and why they dislike each other so much, what they represent in society and what it means. This video will look at 4 ways the right and the left are different and how they clash. You know, I've said it before on this channel plenty of times and I'm going to say it again here, but our minds are inherently self-serving and irrational. We ignore information we don't like. Social media algorithms have figured out how to take advantage of this. They push us down rabbit holes that reinforce our beliefs about the world, which might feel good, but it's not good for us. But what if there's a way out of the rabbit hole? Ground News is an app for anyone looking to escape the
Now that we've established his opinion is for sale, let's get into this. This is just like, oh my god. How does somebody like this get ads? This guy's, like, in practical terms, super right-wing. Is that a thing that I can do? Is that a thing I should be doing? Fascists are not revolutionary. Fascists aren't revolutionary in the sense that they still fetishize the state, but they are revolutionary in the vulgar sense in which they want to establish a state of affairs that has hitherto had no existence on Earth, right? They aren't revolutionary in the Marxist sense. Marx would appropriately call fascists, just as he criticizes Hegel, and of course the doctrine of fascism was ghostwritten by a major Hegelian scholar, Gentili, in Italy. So Yeah, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that fascists aren't revolutionary. I would say that they aren't. I would say they're still shackled to a fetish of history that really shouldn't be associated with the human simplicator. But Ground News also sponsors channels like Azura Scapegoat, which is interesting. I don't know who that is, but hey, you could get ads if you had a bigger audience. That's about it. Yeah, fair enough. All right. Hopefully this ad doesn't take too long.
Perpetual culture wars between the right and the left. It lets you easily compare how a story is being covered by sources across the political spectrum. And unlike social media and other news aggregators, Ground doesn't use your browsing history to manipulate the news you see. In fact, they go out of their way to show you.
Thank God. All right, let's skip ahead. There we go.
The main determining factor here is that the right and the left care about fundamentally different values. Very smart social psychologist John Haidt did scientific studies that found that there are 6 fundamental human values that we all share.
Jonathan Haidt is not super smart. Okay, so let's just take a look at this graph quickly. How relevant to moral judgment? I have no memory of this. Okay, so we'll let him explain it, but I'm noticing here like harm, fairness. I don't know what in-group is supposed to refer to. Authority, purity. These are... What is purity? I don't know.
However, when looking at different political positions, he found that conservatives, libertarians, and progressives put extremely different emphases on these different values. For a summary, these values are harm, which says...
What is a progressive? I don't know what that refers to. Like, progressive... Like, progressive is a super vague term. Same with libertarian. Like, what does libertarian refer to? Vosh identifies as a libertarian.
That hurting others is bad. Fairness, or that people should reap what they sow. Liberty, or that people shouldn't oppress their social inferiors. Loyalty, which is self-explanatory. Respect for authority. And purity, or that certain things are sacred and can't be violated.
Okay, so I'm assuming because loyalty is self-explanatory, it literally means that you have loyalty, that you have some kind of personal connection to an entity that is taking part in, or that is playing a role in a moral decision or something like that. Harm, don't hurt others. Okay, so that's the harm principle. That's super contingent and recent and post-French Revolution. Fairness, people should reap what they sow. That's not a universal definition of fairness at all. Authority, respect for social superiors. I don't like that one. I don't like that one for the simple reason that I don't think, even amongst a lot of revolutionaries, even anarchists, there is baked in a lack of respect. I mean, there are certainly in cases, but there isn't necessarily a lack of respect for social superiors. Rather, there is a deep skepticism about whether or not people who are materially socially superior are in fact superiors by right, and therefore command deference justly. Like that strikes me as the main contention when people are talking about unjust hierarchies. It's not that there aren't actual disparities in knowledge and ability and things like that. It's that the people who, even in terms of disparities of knowledge and ability today, those are downstream from material differences that don't actually reflect native ability, right? So, like, somebody who's rich has a much less stressful childhood, they have better nutrition, they get sent to a better school, they're taken more seriously, they're treated better, they're happier, they're less damaged when they go out into the world. That person will probably end up being a lot more able than somebody else starting off with the exact same, you know, personal qualities, whatever personal qualities one has as an infant. Simply because of those conditions which are conferred on that person to the exclusion of the other unjustly. I don't think that there is necessarily a lack of respect for social superiors. I think there's a tremendous respect for social superiors in a lot of leftist circles. I think it's primarily, like, again, this is all overly simplified and just mashed together into a lump as if these were simple, like, yes-no things. Purity, certain things are sacred and cannot be transgressed. Like, that's nonsense. People who advocate for the right to things like drinking water or housing or stuff like that, they absolutely hold human life to be sacred, or life generally to be sacred. What they may not hold to be sacred are things like churches, right? Big gold temples to the book that says, "Give all that you have to the poor." For God's sake, Christ was whipping people in the temple himself, right? He was concerned with purity, but not with things like niceties, or not with things like manners.
Progressives are extremely high in the value harm. This is why left-wingers will say, children are starving in Africa, how can we do nothing? Afterwards, progressives are interested in liberty or caring about if people are oppressed by unfair hierarchies, which is a lot of where their emphasis on helping oppressed groups comes from. Liberals also care a certain degree about fairness. However, after that, liberals don't care about any of the other values. Conservatives have...
Hang on. Liberals don't care about any of the other values, like loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, sanctity, degradation. Let's even take like the most cliched account of like a socialist, advocate for the lower classes. That person is absolutely loyal to their movement. They're loyal to the class that they're advocating on behalf of. They believe in the authority of certain thinkers. They believe in the authority of certain figures within certain classes, things like that. And they absolutely hold human life to be sacred. And they hold a host of different things to be sacred as well, like human freedom, or like respect for the environment, things like that. Like this is so reductive, but it's not just reductive. It's basically a lie and a cliche. Like, if you care for victims of oppression, like, what does this word sanctity mean in this context, if not care, right? Or is it only sanctity if it's connected to some kind of magical woo-woo thing?
However, after that, liberals don't care about any of the other values. Conservatives, however, are pretty well balancing all 6 values, with high emphasis on authority, loyalty, maintaining moral purity, harm, and liberty.
Yeah, see, so it's like leftists are just mentally damaged, is what this amounts to. Whereas conservatives are balanced. So the distinction between right and left isn't that one is advocating for something that's really harmful to a large amount of the population, and the other one is advocating against that. The distinction is that one is balanced and able to take into account all the facts and make the hard, cold decisions that we just need to make, and the other side just can't handle it. They just can't process these other things. This is childish.
Conservatives are more similar to the rest of history in the world. In non-Western societies, for example, people are higher in authority, loyalty, and purity. Progressives are more so the far extension of the West's greater emphasis on harm and liberty that started during the Middle Ages.
No, I don't think so. Maybe liberty, to be sure. But I think what it actually represents is that we first saw the strongest case of ideological breakdown in the context of the French Revolution. And in the context of the Glorious Revolution in England as well, where you have the traditional nobility being directly challenged as being in their position by right. Like that, this is not a point against the left wing at all. Which I understand, like in the context of this video, he's not necessarily framing it as this is why the left is in some sense inferior. I mean, he would argue that. But like this whole presentation is absolutely pushing that position. Jordan Peterson does this too. I was going to mention this in my stream on Beyond Order, which I never did, mostly because I just wasn't confident enough to do it. I originally had a partner who backed out. But he at one point, he talks about a right-wing tendency. He may be actually drawing from Haidt directly. He was in communication with him. He was actually on some talk show with him at one point. Talk show, or I guess the line's blurred now. But he characterizes the right wing as being defined by certain psychological tendencies. Not true at all. The right wing is defined by certain very exclusionary policy positions, ultimately, with border protectionism, things like that. Increasingly, either directly or via the alibi of culture, racial purity, things like that. And the left is being opposed to these, again, very practical positions. You don't have to have a specific attitude to take those positions. You could have practical arguments. There are a lot of people on the left with very conservative mindsets. In the proper sense, not conservative in the sense of this joke of of a graph here.
Libertarians are interesting in that they, like progressives, are mostly focused on a handful of values and ignore the rest. But
that is terribly wrong. Libertarians are far from interesting.
They're super strong in liberty and fairness, which is why libertarians want as little government as possible and are
except Dilvani.
Fine with prostitution, marijuana, and guns. An interesting thing is that the social justice wing of the left has picked up a new attribute, extremely high purity, in which saying the wrong words, misappropriating, and the like is treated as an attack on the sanctity of their movement.
Okay, so are sanctity and purity the same thing then in this context? I think he's buying into the whole... Because I know Jonathan Haidt does this stupid thing where he characterizes the left, quote-unquote, as a religion, right? Whatever the hell that means. He, I believe, takes the Durkheimian view of religion, which you should never do, because Durkheim did something that we know is very silly. He took the model of the Christian church, and he used it like a cookie cutter, and tried to find what in other cultures fit that shape. And that's basically what it is. And he does so explicitly, because he breaks down society into elements like church. No, that's not how you do religious studies today. When we know that that is not a ubiquitous form. If you want to still deploy the term religion, you would want to be very careful about the actual trajectory of that term historically. You would want to look at its origins in ancient Rome, where it refers to, again, like a term that had some time to develop before it started referring to what it refers to now, or even referred to then. But you would start looking at religio, referring to, like in a general sense, a gravity about certain things. Like you swear an oath, there's a religio about it. You go into a temple or a court, there's a religio about it. When you had people people starting to panic and start to get involved in these dangerous and socially harmful cults, you would have Cicero distinguish between religio as being like the proper amount of that kind of gravity, of that kind of sense of care, of scruples about things, and superstitio, which is an excess of them. And then later you have that becoming no longer a matter of degree, but simply a binary between these practices are superstitio, these practices are religio. And then the church takes over, and now you have religios being the different orders, the different, what's the word I'm looking for? The different monastic orders. And their practices and things like that. And then eventually you have colonialism, and you have sociologists and whatnot attempting to, not sociologists, but you have like early social scientists, for lack of a better word, trying to understand the composition of different cultures, and they would use religio as a model. They would religion as a model, and they would say, well, where is the religion in these different places? And now you would have it deployed to refer to essentially what are the what's the word? What are the things? I'm losing my language here. What are the things that are like the church in these different cultures? Like, where is their church? Where is their corresponding religion, right? Because they took the structure of their communities for granted, and they thought that this is simply a level of a thing that we develop into. Well, where have they developed to with this? Like, have they grown proper religion yet in the modern sense? Remember, civilization, you can even understand it by the word. It used to refer to a process, not to an entity, right? But like to characterize, for example, an oversensitivity in certain left-wing groups, with I remember, for example, being in a class on indigenous politics in university, and we were reading a very terrible book called "This Is Not a Peace Pipe," and the author, who I believe was named Dale Turner, he proposed, because this is about, we were talking about the indigenous resurgence movement of sort of a cultural resurgence of traditional indigenous ways of thinking and things like that in the modern world. He proposed that indigenous activists and scholars really try to push indigenous traditional stories as indigenous philosophy. And I took a serious issue with that, because philosophy emerges specifically against poetry. And it seems to me that what's actually happening is, for the sake of a cultural movement, pushing indigenous stories as philosophy is really to cover over actual indigenous philosophy. And I made this point, and people took offense to it. I don't remember how I worded it exactly, but I don't think it was that egregious. But, you know, people were overly sensitive about it, because it sounds like, what do you mean indigenous people can't have philosophy? Well, no, actually, quite the opposite. The point is, they can and have. Maybe it wasn't written down, but people actually absolutely had philosophical conversations and thought hard about the world, and even came to some deep understanding about it. A lot of things that are lost to us simply because, due to our recklessness, a lot of them died. And B, again, just like the issue of these being oral traditions and things like that, and a combination of them being lost to time, enshrined in stories, and the oral traditions themselves not being treated with very much respect. If you look at Lao Tzu, for example, the largely fictional author of the Tao Te Ching, you find a conception of the world that is very similar to Hegel's. These people in antiquity were very, very smart. But to bring us back to the point of this, I don't think people being conditioned to be oversensitive in specific social contexts counts as a kind of religious obsession with purity. That's nonsense. What it is people bluntly not being socialized well and being rewarded for whatever reason, probably for the same reasons that a lot of people turn right-wing libertarian, just from the stuff they watch on television. People behaving badly is not a good way to characterize individual people behaving badly in certain social contexts. Is not a great way to is not in itself evidence for a social. It's not the basis for an anthropology. We'll just say that.
Treated as an attack on the sanctity of their movement. Something I want to make clear is that all these values are fundamentally irrational, and each political position has rational arguments that can be used to justify it. We don't choose our politics based off rational decisions. They're given to us by a combination of genetics, upbringing, and a little bit of rationality on our part.
Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. No, okay, so every single development towards more and more openness in politics, even the invention of politics itself, with the reforms by the tyrants and by Solon in ancient Athens, these have all been the product of deliberate planning and deliberate action. Every political movement has been the product of deliberate action, of reason to preferences about the way things should be run and structured. Like, this is ridiculous. But it's what this it's what this way of viewing things relies upon, because if you're going to say that your political position is just the result of a certain inbuilt tendency, well, that's exactly what you're saying here. You're saying that your genes and your environment, the environment's very broad. Your genes and your upbringing, these are the only things that determine ultimately where you fall politically, and that's nonsense. Even that language of falling politically, it's very ideologically specific, that characterization, because it sort of assumes that there's just this range of options that are already given, and we just select them sort of like we select a club or a favorite restaurant, or like, you know, a genre of literature we like, whatever. We have these tendencies, we have these tastes, and we just kind of fall in with where our tastes lead us. Nobody thinks, nobody, like, writes gigantic tomes criticizing the contingent history of the time and place in which they live and the institutions enshrined therein. No, it's all just genes and personality. It's rubbish. It's just nonsense. It's just not true. There is no, like, even like in pre-literate societies, you had people with very real, what we would call class identities. When you talk about in ancient Athens, with the opening of the vote and of property rights and of, you know, rights to not be sold into slavery if you default on a loan, these were pushed for because tyrants were able to appeal to the class interest of the poor or of the dispossessed, who had very concrete ties with one another based on their material conditions. And they reasoned that to support the tyrant against the traditional king, or the traditional archon, or the traditional, the priest ruler, they reasoned that this would be in their interest, and it was. And afterwards, people reasoned about, what was the significance of this. Like, I don't know why on earth anyone who actually like reads the history of politics, of any politics, whether we're talking like long scale or even just a specific, the avowed goals of any movement in a particular location at a particular time, to say that it's just the result of genes and attitudes, when there are real, in every single case, real material reasons to want certain things, is absurd.
It's entirely fine that morality is mostly irrational. Take, for example, that on a purely rational basis, consensual cannibalism or incest with good contraception is totally fine, but most of us would just say it can be disgusted by those. On an entirely rational basis, you could justify the Nazis, since if you start with the Darwinistic assumption that spreading your genes is the most important thing, and people of your ethnic group have similar genes to you, then wiping out other groups that gives your group and your family more breeding abilities and population potential, as most animals do, is entirely justified. The position...
Now, guys, I don't support genocide. I'm just saying. No, rationally, the Nazi view of a tier of races, was entirely pseudoscientific. Their view of reality is a battle to pass in our genes, often fought between ethnic groups. No, a battle to pass in our genes between ethnic groups is not backed by science today. Not at all. In fact, when you look at the way in which mankind spread in our prehistory over Europe, it was way too fast to have anything to do whatsoever with natural selection. And in any case, we weren't fighting for territory until relatively recently in our history, in the sense of associating our nation with the borders of a state. We did fight over like hunting ground and fishing stuff. We fought over resources, of course, but there wasn't this concept of a territorial entity that must fight, like a cell in a petri dish, other territorial entities for dominance over the world.
Is entirely justified. The position that genociding people outside of your group is...
And crucially, like, if you actually, like, pay attention to fascist philosophy, and I'm mainly conversant with, I should say lightly conversant, with Italian fascism, they largely take on the Hegelian idea of the state as being essentially a kind of life form in and of itself. Not simply an ethnicity, right? It's a specific self-conscious type of social form. Where am I going with this? Anyways, the point is you can't rationally defend this, because this is, first of all, a ridiculous reduction of what actually was thought by these people, and second, because what these people actually thought doesn't stand up to scrutiny if you actually take the stuff they're dealing with seriously.
Morally bad comes from a belief in the individual soul, and that human life is value in general, something which came out of traditional religions, and it's why you saw so much genocide in the ancient world. The Assyrians didn't care when they depopulated entire regions. Another way of viewing it is that your side...
Implying that Christians don't commit genocide. Like, I mean, like, to be clear, it is true that a lot of our conception of morality itself, I mean, first of all, it's not in itself Christian in origin. There was, like religion, a predecessor in Roman thought to what we call morality today. But what we pack into that is absolutely in large measure influenced by Christian thought. But to say that the absence of that is what caused genocide to take place would imply that its presence is what caused genocide to not take place, and that's far from obvious. In fact, depending on your concept of genocide, even in Canada, we're digging up graves now of children who were picked up because they just on cultural / ethnic grounds, because really ethnic grounds veiled by culture, we're digging up children who were stolen because their parents and their parents' culture was simply not respected. In fact, not only not respected, but treated as something to be wiped out. And this was largely carried out, again, by Christians. Not just by Christians, but largely by Christians. So, and then, of course, like, I don't know how far you want to carry this, but like the LRA, for God's sake, is called the Lord's Resistance Army. Lord's Resistance Army. You can tell I'm tired. It's been a long couple of days, but this, no. And even in antiquity, you did have people talk about, at the very least, the killing of whole cities as being excessive or imprudent. So,
frame of logic might not be the other side's. For example, a progressive might think that a conservative's insistence upon national honor is inherently irrational, but in real terms, nations that appear weak in the world stage are attacked more since they look like they're easy pickings.
Citations, please. Like, I'm sorry, the United States... like, does he think the United States will be invaded if a large number of people in the United States are skeptical of the sacredness of the military or something? Notice what he's doing here. Like that point about the example about the horrific thing like cannibalism. That was lifted directly from the book. It seems to me, judging from what I've seen of What If Altists' work, is that he largely just skims books and just rips from them. He doesn't critically consider what he's analyzing or what he's doing. He just rips from books and just throws things together really fast. Because he's been rewarded for doing so. Because apparently the algorithm prefers bullshit above everything else. We see here he has 272,000 subscribers. Like, good God. Why?
For conservatives, the Vietnam War made total sense if America was seen to not be protecting its allies, then other American allies would be attacked, thus making the cost worthwhile.
I don't know enough off the top of my head about political opinions by conservatives in the Vietnam War, but I don't think that conservatives are, in any sense, consistently on side with the Vietnam War.
For progressives, it was a war of colonial oppression in a useless country that American boys would die in. Similarly, conservatives often view left-wing social spending...
Because that's what it was, objectively. Oh, what is this?
...on stuff like education and social programs as idiotic, given they have no direct economic output, but realistically, education is the best predictor there is out there of economic success. Income inequality, which conservatives either ignore or laud, is an amazing predictor for a series of negative effects that end up hurting the US economy, like crime, single-parent households, lack of social mobility, and the like. In summary, the world's a complicated place, and we should do more listening and less talking.
Agreed. But I mean, like, look at this list. This is exactly what I was talking about before. Like, these are all issues with economic inequality, and here are a list of solutions: global support, trade, fair labor conditions, etc. Like, all of these things are things that people on the left do. And insofar as they exhibit things like a lack of regard for, you know, traditional authorities, or for churches, or for sacred spaces, or for norms of politeness and things like that, it's because those are deployed as weapons to hinder movements on these grounds for cynical ends. Again, like, this isn't a matter of attitude. This has to do with people reasoning to certain behaviors as maybe incorrectly often, as an effective means to achieve reasonable ends. And where you fall in that case would be determined by things like your personal willingness to examine yourself, and your level of education resulting therefrom. Now, you notice sneaking in there a little bit, there is still an element of personality involved, because you need to have a character such that you are willing to do those things. But what that's reflecting ultimately is not an attitude that you have, it's your interest. It's saying that you stand to benefit or to lose from adopting a certain stance or a certain or by advocating for a certain thing, and you don't want to do that. And that can even be at the level of like your sense of your sense of security. The idea that the church, say, or a church to be more specific, is involved in an anti-human activity of some kind, like maybe there's a pastor who is actively railing against some kind of, equalization movement or something in some area, as happens. Like there are tons of pastors who rail against the communists and things like that. And if you recognize that this person that you look to for guidance and on whose credibility and integrity you stake the immortality you've been brought up to think is essential to your sense of self-worth, and to ward off the fear of death and things like that, you have every incentive to not look too hard at the positions that you have been brought up to take. But that's not a matter of attitude. That's not a matter of genes. That's a weakness of character that you can choose to overcome. You're aware of that. If it goes against your interests, you feel the agitation. You have that uneasy notion in the back of your head that you're letting yourself off easy.
More listening and less talking. This explains why when conservatives, progressives, or libertarians argue with the other, their arguments often fall on deaf ears. A progressive might argue for gay rights since it's a representation of their harm and liberty functions to help the oppressed, while a religious conservative coming from a Christian background would view it as an attack upon the Christianity that has held their civilization together for 2,000 years through a purity function.
Yeah, but largely they aren't going to be exactly dispassionate about that either. They are going to be extraordinarily threatened by any of these different things. Why? Because again, like, how you determine that somebody is really invested in a thing is the extent to which they are angry or upset by the outcome, or by things that imply a negative outcome vis-a-vis their position. When you have conservatives going on about how, only traditional marriage is appropriate, often there is a very real anxiety going on there. They are made uncomfortable by the existence of gay marriage in some respect. It's not that every single conservative is suddenly like a super down-to-earth, hardcore political thinker when it comes to the necessity of heterosexual marriage to the stability of the state, because they're not. It's because this particular thing, because there are a host of different things that you can find in the Bible even, that actually do have, by the way, deleterious effects on certain social forms. And crucially, sometimes those deleterious effects are to be desired from our stance. Like, for example, the idea that women should be able to speak in church, or that you should be able to marry based on love and not based on family interest. Like, these are things that are heavily damaging to certain social forms, and I would say that that's a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing that that conservatives of Roman patriarchy lost, right? So this largely has to do with, again, not innate attitudes, but people conditioned to recognize things as threats to their own interest. And we can extend interest to mean not just like, a concrete interest like your aggregate wealth, something like that. It could also be like the perceived insecurity of relations that you've been conditioned to find uncomfortable becoming normalized. Like I understand growing up, especially in a conservative household, the attitude towards non-heterosexual relationships that people get. They're sort of conditioned in a way, like in conservative fundamentalist households, say. My household wasn't so fundamentalist, at least in the end. but it was definitely on the conservative end. And you're almost, the way it's exposed to you, you're conditioned to almost regard it as like incest. So you end up becoming extremely uncomfortable with it because the people you associate, because it's first of all, it's not normalized. So gay people are seen as doing something very strange and unusual. And typically you are only aware of them doing that as adults, and so you associate homosexual relations with relations between people that at that stage in your life you regard as parental and advisory figures who are doing something apparently irresponsible and weird and right? And you can carry that for a very long time after the fact, because if you're if that's the case, if that attitude prevails where you're growing up, then you're not going to hear about people who are younger, who are around, more relatable to you, engaging in those kinds of things, in those kinds of relationships, because everybody like you is terrified to be associated with that. Like that's how stigmatization works. So, anyways, here we go.
The big thing you need to understand of the modern left-right binary is that it's a way of figuring out the trajectory of Western civilization in a post-Christian world. For 2,000 years, morality and ethics were relatively easy since one just referenced the Bible.
Okay, I'm gonna refill my tea for a second, then we'll come back. I'll just be a minute. All right, we're back. Let's look at chat here quickly. Okay, kids, play nice. All right. Let's keep going. Religion.
The reason that the fight between the right and the left is so contentious is that at heart it's a religious war, and that both sides have what amounts to entire metaphysical views about how the world works and what the direction of Western civilization should be going forward. First of all, I'm using religion here to describe a
Okay, sorry, this is just bugging me as a word to the wise. Metaphysics does not tell you how the world works. Metaphysics tells you how are there things in the world? How do those things exist? Physics will tell you how the world works. Metaphysics deals with things like time. Working is something that takes place over time. So metaphysics will never deal with how It will deal with how things work in time and like in a philosophical sense, but it will never tell you about like how contingent practical things like human societies function. It just doesn't do that. But again, like, we're going to be retreating this a lot, I think. This is just preposterous. People don't... The French Revolution wasn't the result of different metaphysics. The French Revolution was the result of particular people having a particular interest in the dissolution of an order that other people had a particular interest in sustaining by any means necessary. It has nothing to do with metaphysics, ultimately. Now, granted, and Marx observes this, a metaphysical stance, or a philosophical stance, rather, in the hands of a politically awakened group can absolutely be a material force in and of itself. But metaphysics qua metaphysics? No. Not even close.
Comprehensive ideology that tells people how the world works, how they can be good people, creates a community of believers, and provides ceremonies.
Right, so he's... Hang on, I want to make sure. Was that ethics or was that metaphysics?
God doesn't have to be involved. Take Buddhism or Confucianism that are at heart atheist. Or look at
Okay, hang on. I want to make sure I understood what he was saying there.
That tells people how the world works, describe a comprehensive ideology that tells people how the world works, how they can be good people, creates a community of believers, and provides ceremonies.
I see. Okay, so he was just listing off all of these. I thought he was... When he said metaphysics, I thought he was elaborating on what metaphysics was. Okay, fine. I mean, this is... That's iffy. What religions do. I mean, religions might not do this, right? Like, you can go to church for years and have a pastor who never talks about, you know, the constitution of reality. How it... I mean, of course, it is a community, so it's always going to involve people coming together, insofar as, again, we're talking about a church, not religion qua religion. It may involve ritual. In fact, the act of coming together could be a ritual. Ethics, how should I live? That's iffy. There are a lot of political pastors who don't regard that stuff as being important at all. So, let's fast forward here.
Doesn't have to be involved. Take Buddhism or Confucianism that are at heart atheist. Or look at communism, in which the certain...
Hang on. Religions. What is this? What the hell? Oh, I see. Okay, so... Wait, Nazism is a religion? And communism is a religion. The controlling force is the dialectic of history. Okay, so here's a question for you. Just let's talk about this dialectic of history idea for a second, because he's treating this as like this divine thing. This mystery thing. Okay. Somebody in the wilderness figures out how to make animal skin into an elastic string, and he figures out that can propel things. So he invents the bow and arrow. Okay. Now all of a sudden, everybody in his tribe is learning how to use bows and arrows because it makes hunting more efficient. And now suddenly, you have people in that society who are building bows and arrows as a profession. That's a dialectic. It's where you have, it's where historical things interact with the world such that new things are emerging from that. It's not that mysterious. That's like a super reduced way of viewing it. But the dialectic is literally just talking about how, like, there's a kind of material instantiation of a conversation between actions and developments and things like that. What the? And the controlling forces, survival of the fittest and Nazism, okay. Social justice has the moral arc. What the hell is the moral arc of history? The in-group is being woke. Communism is the workers. Okay. Then there's the utopia is the Superman. True communism. This is dumb. This is really dumb. And my God, like the how squashed some of these are. It's painful to look at.
Dialectic of history acts exactly as a god would. Nazism, communism, Christianity, and the like all fulfill the...
Okay, so No, no, the dialectic of history does not behave as a god would. The dialectic of history is just a process. It's just a material process in the world. And it's kind of obvious, actually. It's not that esoteric or strange. Like, think of science. That's a good example. This is the one Hegel gives. That's one example Hegel gives. So, Pythagoras in the wilderness, he's just playing with stuff. He doesn't have, like, an advanced scientific apparatus. He's just, he's experimenting with the world and he's thinking stuff because he's it's interesting, that's all. And he determines that there's order in nature. We can do math, right? And then other people now start doing geometry. They start measuring things, and they realize that you can apply principles in geometry to things other than simply measuring obvious material, concrete objects and things like that. And over time, you have emerging from this a concept of justice. There is not just order in the world in the sense of things have values that can be depended upon, or things have dimensions, rather, that can be depended upon to determine the dimensions of other things, or the dimensions of their constituent parts. You can also have a kind of order inbuilt into the best way to order a society. And so you have, is it pronounced DK or Dike? You have justice being reconstrued as a goddess, as being a fixture of the world itself, as being something divine, as being something there. And then over time, people continue to apply geometry and mathematics to the world, and they start to understand science as being associated with a method of applying these things, as opposed to different forms of thinking about things. And so science itself starts to change and think about itself as it interacts with the world. That's a dialectic. It's a going out of yourself into the world, interacting with stuff, and then coming back in and changing yourself and reflecting on yourself by reference to those foreign things. Like, we know this happens. This isn't weird. I wish Hegel hadn't put it in such weird terms, but yeah, no, it doesn't act like a god. If anything, what it conduces to in Hegel's concept of spirit is a kind of universal self-awareness that is, in a sense, godlike. Again, that's introduced a distinction between God and the dialectic of history.
Exact same role inside our heads, and so I classify them as the same. In America and in most of Europe, the dominant parties are both fundamentally liberal, and that their predominant presupposition is that individual rights and the collective well-being is good and should be the dominant aim of society. However, the problem with liberalism, or the idea that the ultimate aim of society should be individual rights, is that it doesn't deal with any of the other aims of religion. It doesn't tell you how to be a good person, build communities, or deal with the heartbreak of death, childbirth, and the like. Liberalism was an extension of a pre-existing Christian civilization whose foundations it depended upon. To be brutally honest, the idea that the
Oh, he's just going a mile a minute, isn't he? It's almost impossible to follow him. Like, why is he racing like this? It makes it almost impossible to critique or evaluate. Maybe that's deliberate, I don't know. But, like, this is not how you do it. Like, the speed at which he's just racing over topics, it's... Okay, let's read this. The main problem with liberal philosophy is its dependence on a series of stabilizing conditions, the largest of which is Christianity to maintain itself. I would have said something like, private property and capitalism, but whatever. Around the world, Christianity declines, so does liberalism. Without an afterlife, envy from the market grows impossible to control. Without belief in God, people always lean towards man-made stability like authoritarianism or the nanny state. Without belief in the soul, people start thinking that the ends justify the means, thus allowing horrifying totalitarian regimes that killed more than any religion in history. Liberalism ignores that people normally act as groups, looking for company and sex, thus atomizing society. Wait, what? People normally act as groups looking for company and sex. You can do that as you do that as an individual. In fact, if you're looking for company, you are explicitly acting as an individual, because if you're not an individual, you're already in company. And liberalism doesn't atomize society. Like when you look at the father of liberalism, Thomas Hobbes, he's explicit about this. He is describing the condition, and this is before John Locke, mind you. He is describing the condition of human beings in his day and age, of men in his own time. That is, and he's extrapolating from that to what they must have been in the past if they remained the same kind of thing to get to where they are now. We were individualized well in advance of liberalism. Philosophy has always trailed behind the actual material conditions of a society. Always. By the time Aristotle was characterizing the ideal state as on the model of the Athenian polis, that political form disappeared. It had already been subsumed under the Macedonians. And you had empires going forward. Without belief in God, people always lean towards man-made stability. People lean towards man-made stability with or without God. Like, I don't know if you noticed this, but the religious states were states. They did everything a state did. Without belief in the soul, people start thinking that the ends justify the means. Like, that doesn't follow. That doesn't follow. Despite being commanded in their very holy book that those who live by the sword will die by the sword, they had absolutely no problem. Christian states had no problem waging vicious wars. And beyond the line of European space, when they went to the New World, it was a bloodbath. They had no problem whatsoever with enacting extreme amounts of violence. And indeed authoritarianism. So, this is just preposterous. Again, this whole characterization of this reduction of real rational contingent, that's crucial, historically contingent issues to attitudes, and then this association between, irrational attitudes and religion, because of course religion is irrational. This is dumb. This is such an impoverished social ontology. Like, you can't think with this. This is why I characterize it as a black hole, because it just flattens everything into nothing. Like, there's nothing here. There's no room to even think.
Individual was the fundamental element of society comes from Christianity, which presupposes the existence of a soul that creates a value for human life, alongside Catholicism, which broke up clans by banning cousin marriage, thus making the West the most individualistic civilization in history. The decline in Christianity has also seen the decline in traditional liberalism wherever it's happened, whether in the West after the World Wars with the rise of nanny states and decline in free market capitalism, or with the rise of leftist ideology, or with the rise of atheist ideologies like Nazism and Stalinism that happened after World War I, or with the general weakness of liberal regimes in places like Japan and India that aren't Christian.
Hang on, what did that say? Japan was controlled by a single political party for 50 years and doesn't support women's equality or immigration. Yeah, no, this is beside the point. So to be clear, liberalism doesn't rely upon Christianity in the sense that without Christian beliefs, you can't be liberal. Liberalism emerged, actually, by and large, in critique of the church. Where liberalism starts to rely heavily on Christian ethics is in things like the insistence that human beings have rights as individuals that should be respected, and the right of independent thought. That's critically where that comes in. So you'll look at like John Locke's letter concerning toleration, and he will talk about the limits of the church's ability, which, by the way, are not that tight. The church and the state can actually enforce certain ideas, but he cites the limits of their ability to compel assent to certain beliefs. Like, for example, belief in God or something like that, on the grounds that compelled belief, or compelled assent to those beliefs, rather, doesn't attain salvation anyways. It's a facile commitment that you've extracted.
like Japan and India that aren't Christian. The reason that conservatives are an alliance between the religious and business interests is that the structure of Protestantism allows more active free market capitalism, since once you remove the idea of heaven, envy in society becomes impossible to control.
No. No. The reason for the alliance is because there is a lot of money in evangelical religion. And in the LDS Church. I believe the Latter-day Saints were crazy big landowners in England. I want to look it up again. I did a paper on that a little while ago, and that came up at one point. Not on that specifically, but on... I was taking a religious studies course, and I was focusing on the history of the Latter-day Saints Church. But apparently they're massive accumulators of land. But like, for example, there are Bibles. There's a I think it's a digital copy. There's a digital copy of several different versions of the Bible on the moon, right? Like that is the result of money. That is not like, this is silly. Like, does What If Alt Hist believe that history doesn't exist? Like that there aren't material things that have repercussions historically? Or is this just a world of perfect forms in which everything follows from the magical form of Protestantism, or the magical form of religion, or the magical form of wokeism, or something? This guy is a legit social primitivist.
Which is why, as societies have become less and less Christian, free market capitalism declines and socialist tendencies have increased. The left takes the fundamental...
Hold on. What? That's not true. That's not true at all. Free market capitalism isn't declining. I mean, there's an argument to be made that there actually has never really been real laissez-faire free market capitalism. It's always been regulated in some respect. But that certainly hasn't had a causal relation with Christianity. If anything, that has been directly causally related to responses to abuses by capitalists. Like, there's one in particular that comes to mind, like, especially in things like medicine. So, what was it called? The Dalkon Shield. There was a contraceptive IUD called the Dalkon Shield that had a serious design flaw. It had a string that went through the device and out the other side. Or it was into the device, and for whatever reason, the string was able to make contact with the inside of the uterus. And what that allowed was for bacteria to ascend the string and cause serious uterary infections, resulting in birth defects and sometimes death. And it was pulled, of course, because it caused these issues in a wide number of patients. And so what did Dalkon do? Well, they sold it in Africa. Perfectly in line with a pure free market stance, which is like, well, if it's bad, just let the market decide. Yeah, but we don't really allow that because that's monstrous. So it's I actually don't know. I don't remember that case very well. I hope that was put a stop to. I know there was a scandal about it, but I can't remember what actually came of that.
Mental understanding of Christianity as Jesus taught it, that humans are inherently good and that we just need to spread love and generosity in order to be in the kingdom of heaven.
Well, the Bible teaches that human beings are sinful now. Actually, God created man and woman and declared that they were good, or saw that they were good. So yeah, we are inherently good. That's the point. If we were inherently evil, then God created something inherently evil.
This view was doubled down through
again, like on that
frame of Greek philosophy, since the Gospels were written in Greek, which believes that humans were largely inherently good and rational, and that people were capable of perfectibility through rational thinking. The right was part of the Augustinian worldview that...
I have no idea what that's referring to. Again, like, is he Yeah, that doesn't work.
came out of Persian religions like Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism, which held that the world was a battle between good and evil and that people had to fight against their own inherent evil and greed. The structure of Christianity existed as a bulwark against people who were born in original sin. This
is actually hard to follow because he's not pronouncing his words correctly. He said bulwark, and I thought he said bork for a moment. He needs to slow down. Like, it actually becomes unintelligible. I don't know what people get out of this.
A view that was propounded by St. Augustine and became dominant across the medieval Catholic Church. The right's view of a sinful and constrained humanity is generally that of medieval Christianity, while the left's view of humanity being perfectible through logic and improvement is a view that came through the Renaissance and has grown larger across modern history.
No, again, like, yeah, there are people on the right who sort of have kind of an original sin sort of attitude towards the possibility of social improvement. But like that's not a hand-me-down from Christianity. That's a very typical conservative bias against, I mean conservative in the soft sense. That's a very typical class bias, I should say, against the rudeness of the poor, right? Christianity was, or rather, there were tons of Christians in medieval Europe who were all about education and recognized the serious merits in it, including Aristotle, but not including Aristotle, including Thomas Aquinas, who was thoroughly an Aristotelian in many respects. Not in many respects, in almost all respects.
Interestingly enough, the belief that humans are inherently self-interested allows the right-wingers to deal with their ideological opponents more easily than the left, which views their opponents as inherently evil. For leftists that believe that perfecting the human character is possible, being against their goals means you're trying to hold back progress.
Conservatives tend to view their ideological opponents as foolish and misguided, while progressives view conservatives as evil. I strongly disagree with this one-sided characterization. I don't think all conservatives view, all progressives view conservatives as evil, or even all right-wingers as evil. That's assuming that they even have a concept of evil that they ascribe to in the first place. But conservatives absolutely view progressives as evil. Like, for God's sake, you have Glenn Beck on Fox News a decade ago basically talking about them marching on to the New World Order and the forced administering of the Mark of the Beast. Again, this isn't just like it's tricky to figure out how to approach this, because on the one hand it's extremely incoherent political theory and even anthropology, but on the other hand it's also just so wrong on its face you almost don't need to critique that. It's like the methodology is broken, both in terms of the process and in terms of the categorical assumptions he's taking into this. But then he's just factually wrong in like a really basic way. Like, is this guy just not engaged with it? Is this guy living under a rock? In the modern left, to voice a dissenting opinion on race is to become a racist. That's not true. That's not true at all. There's a lot of disputes in the left on race, whether or not it's a viable category, whether or not, no. It's just not true. Now, if by dissenting opinion on race, he means to voice the opinion that there are essential IQ differences between races that are immutable by material conditions, such that we can rationalize neglecting large parts of our population to poverty, and by large parts of our population I mean non-whites, then yeah, that would be racist definitionally. But I mean, there is absolutely conversation and dispute about the nature of ethnicity and race in the left. For God's sake, there are movements like Pan-Asianism and Pan-Africanism and things like that. Anyways.
This is historically why you've seen a greater degree of fanaticism on the left, or why leftist groups often succumb to radicalism or infighting. The belief in perfectibility is also why left-wingers often succumb to guilt, since
there's a lot of infighting on the left, generally speaking, because from what I have seen, to consistently maintain a position as being on the right today requires having extraordinarily low standards. Whereas, again, the left being defined, because, again, it's not a single thing, except insofar as it is being opposed to the right, which is a very narrow set of positions. The left is everybody else. And so, of course, there's a lot of quote-unquote infighting, because you're watching the world have being filled with people with different opinions and different positions and having reason to things differently. That is actually, that infighting is precisely what would go against its characterization of it in these vulgar terms as a religion, because it doesn't have unifying features. It's a massively heterogeneous category, the left. And who is the left is unclear. Like, is it everybody who is against the right wing? Well, that from a right wing stance, absolutely. But there's a lot of people on the left who regard with a finer eye, or maybe with less carefulness, depending on who you're talking about, will characterize different people who are avowedly on the left and advocate for traditionally left-wing positions as being in some crucial sense reactionary, or in fact right-wing, or conducive to the success of the right. Wait, what is this? 6 characteristics of white male culture in the U.S. Rugged individualism, low tolerance for uncertainty, valuing action over reflection, prioritizing rationality over emotion, seeing time as linear and future-focused. What the hell does that mean? Valuing status... What? Okay, we'll let him talk about this. I have no... What is this? I hope he's not advocating this.
They judge themselves against abstract standards rather than a real...
Wait a minute, did he just show that?
degree of fanaticism on the left, or why leftist groups often succumb to radicalism or infighting. The belief in perfectibility is also why left-wingers often succumb to guilt, since they judge themselves against abstract standards rather than real-world examples, and so don't measure up to perfection.
What did that have to do with anything? Oh god, Thomas Sowell. He just showed that there. That had no bearing on what he was saying. That's weird.
These evolved into 2 visions of the world described by American economist Thomas Sowell of the constrained and unconstrained visions of the world. The unconstrained vision, or that the left holds, is that people are inherently perfectible and naturally good, and that if...
Okay, you notice a trend here where all of these guys are arguing that there is a binary of positions that you can take. That's super important, because if you can reduce politics to a set of 2 stances, of 2 opposed stances, then all you have to do to valorize your stance is show the other stance is in some sense flawed. And it's very easy, because again, like, the left wing is construed as being, as the left wing is construed, it encompasses so many different groups and so many different movements and so many different people. It's super easy to just pile in people of various descriptions behaving badly and attribute that to the left, and then notice how, hey, look at all of these nicely dressed, well-educated white people on the right. Aren't they nicer? Aren't they more careful? Things like that. And all of the little things that, all the more important things, the material things, that actually led to these people being where they are, and deciding to be where they are, and deciding to advocate on behalf of the things that they do, that gets completely elided. Because now all you're looking at is, well, there's one thing here that looks nice, and there's one thing here that has a lot of ugliness in it. So I'm going to reject that, and I'm just going to stick over here where it's safe.
If there's a problem in the world, it has to be someone's fault, given that human nature and the world is naturally good and fair. This is why when there's a disparity in something like... And
it's like it has to be someone's fault. Well, we're talking about the human world. We're talking about the world of history, of people acting and creating and doing things, and often doing very bad things. And insofar as the condition in which we find ourselves is the result of that, then absolutely there is somebody at fault. But more importantly, it may be the case that somebody is actively profiting off of a situation that is actually going to hurt us, or is hurting us now. Case in point, we just had the UN report on climate change saying that we are basically immutably going to be going up by something to the tune of 2 degrees over the next, was it 50 years? Something like that? Like, that is precisely because of a very small number of people being extraordinarily selfish and nihilistic and not caring that they're destroying the human world. You have stuff like that all over the map, and that even is instantiated at the level of things like class, or overlaps between race and class, where you have people who are completely aloof to the consequences of certain things like, for example, segregation and stuff like that. Advocating on behalf of those things because it's more comfortable for them to do so, and then characterizing people who advocate against that, people who are probably in many cases directly suffering as a result of that, of being like ruffians and rabble-rousers and things like that. I'm saying things like that a lot.
Income range between ethnic groups or between genders and the like, left-wingers look for an oppressive group like the patriarchy or racism, since in their worldview, unfairness and inequality are the exception, not...
Good God, the editing on this. They create a disbalance. It really... he really rushes these, doesn't he? The patriarchy isn't a group. Sexism isn't a group. These are tendencies that have a real material fallout. Like, for example, if you only treat women as being appropriate to certain kinds of tasks, then they aren't going to be raised, or they aren't going to have in their environment things that, what's the word I'm looking for? There's going to be a deficit of encouragements in their environment towards those different kinds of tasks, opposite men who are going to have an excess of those things. Or if you have hostile attitude, or if you have toxic attitudes towards women in certain institutions, that's going to have results. Like these aren't groups. Like even with the racism thing, like people will point, we haven't had slavery in however many years. Black people got the vote in the last century. It's like okay, but like do you really think that fact in and of itself neuters the historical runoff of the previous state of affairs? Like no, of course not. And there's other things too, like it's like, for God's sake, he was just talking about the role of Christianity in liberalism. Same thing. Like, it only happens with the good stuff that you like?
The norm. Since left-wingers think that people are naturally good and perfectible, and the world's able to be improved through conscious reforms, that people who are cultivated and educated and sincere, which often ends up being intellectuals, are capable of making real progress in the world and improving the human race through reform.
I would challenge him to find a major left-wing theorist, and we can be generous about what left-wing means in this context, who thinks that mankind is quote-unquote perfectible. Because first of all, like, that assumes things that to my ears ring as inherently, well, not inherently, as very much against the grain of most left-wing thinking that is anti-teleological with respect to human beings, that emphasizes human freedom and autonomy over rigid conceptions of what human flourishing is, and conceives of human flourishing largely in the extent to which people are enabled to be healthy and spontaneous in their creative activity. So I would love to see him respond to that, but otherwise this is just, I don't know where he's pulling this from. It seems pretty random, frankly. Like, historical materialism is brutal, and the people who come after are, as is a general rule, because again, like it's like science, right? Science changes as it evolves, but it's from generation to generation. Like, we improve, sure, but the individual doesn't really reap the benefits. The individual dies ignorant of everything that comes after, and people stand on his shoulders, him remaining, of course, dead and unawares, and then repeats ad nauseum. But there's no perfection of mankind. There's just There's just a constant improvement. And improvement characterized in pragmatic terms, like this is the thing we are trying to do. We are trying to understand this more and more and more. And insofar as we are getting closer and closer to understanding this or to accomplishing this, this is improving. But that's not like when he's characterizing it as mankind is perfectible. That has baked into it a concept of the perfect, and I don't think that reflects any left-wing thought that I've heard. I think pragmatically there's a definite preference towards the democratic and the equal, but that's not like perfection in the Christian sense. There's a goal that we can accomplish, and I don't see any reason to think that that's unreasonable. Like, imagine if the alternative answer was fielded 1,000 years ago, and we just, it was still well, 2,000 years ago. It was still just rich 2,500 years ago. It was still just rich Athenians who called the shots and everything. I mean, it wouldn't have been, because they would have been wiped out, because they would not have been nearly as strong, because you need democracy to become a sea power. But that's a different story.
A racist joke is slowing down the perfection of the human race, which will solve the rest of the problems. Human beings are in control of the world, and thus by perfecting humanity, we are perfecting the ability to deal with other broader problems in the world. However, on the right, which believes that human nature is inherently self-interested, if not evil, society exists in order to keep back our inherent moral weakness. They don't believe human nature is perfectible, and rather that existence is a permanent battle against the forces of evil and chaos, and that we need processes and organizations like religion, property rights, and capitalism to hold back the demons inside the human spirit.
So how is there any civilization at all? Like, this is so dumb. What the hell is this? Are these zombies? What?
They believe that we're permanently on the precipice of a dark age and that we need to fight evil foreign powers which will otherwise pull us backwards. The right believes civilization is a boat floating in a dark sea, while left-wingers view history as a process of continual improvement. For business interests, capitalism is a way of creating a fair system that operates independently of a powerful government and personal discretion. For the religious, religion is a way of fighting the inherent sinfulness of the soul, and for militarists, force is a way of stopping evildoers. Right-wingers support the processes that give the status quo stability. In summary, the right-winger believes that the human race is incidental to the world, and that factors like geography, pre-existing systems, and the like are more...
If right-wingers... Hang on. If right-wingers supported processes that kept the status quo stable, they would be supporting processes that are actively opposed to them. The institutional bent of many societies, of many states, is not pro-right-wing at all. So that's just factually untrue, obviously. And secondly, like there's a huge... Right-wingers are not inherently conservative. Now, when I say that they're relatively homogenous compared to the left, that's because largely their policy positions today amount to the same thing. Whether or not you're concerned with maintaining Christian culture in a community or maintaining whiteness, these often amount to this. You solve both by the same measure of disallowing immigration, right? Things like that. But no. You're only conservative if you're... I'm not just nominally conservative. You're only conservative if you're actually conserving the status quo. And in this context, the person who's conserving the status quo isn't Richard Spencer with his dream of a white ethno-state somewhere in the, I don't know, the prairies somewhere. It's with Jonathan Haidt, who's treating the status quo as the state of nature, as simply how things are, as not a contingent fact, as these divisions between right and left as being simply attitudinal differences, such that the success of either one constitutes an actual failure. It constitutes a descent into extremism and not a rational activity that can be characterized as the real protagonist of history ultimately. It's a deviation. Like that... Oh man, how much longer is this? This is exhausting. Alright, well, let's just power through this. I'm kind of dumbfounded here just by Like that, what did he even say in the last 5 minutes? That was such a blur. He's just blasting through things. Oh, is that Warhammer Total War fan art? That makes sense. He probably thinks fascism is left-wing. Well, he thinks that Nazism is a religion, so that might be a step up.
More important than human agency and human goodwill. Right-wingers don't trust experts and academics who they believe to be influenced by their own greedy self-interests, but like people who have done well inside pre-established hierarchies like capitalists inside the market or generals inside the army. Right-wingers hold that culture holds back human nature, while left-wingers find culture oppressive and think that human nature, which is liberated through an impersonal government, will set us free. And I mean, realistically, you do find examples.
No, human nature won't set us free. That's literally why left-wingers become revolutionary. It's a strenuous effort against the status quo, often against human nature. If it was baked into human nature to be left-wing, which I realize isn't what he's saying. if they were assuming that they were on the side of human nature, then they would be at the center of gravity, right? Like when we talk about human nature, typically what we're gesturing towards is our natural tendencies. Like our tendency to choose the easy way out, or our tendency to lie when it serves to not lie would be to endanger ourselves. I'm skeptical of concepts of human nature generally, but like, where even to begin? This is just, like, it's almost just making stuff up. I find with so much of material like this, it's just endless making stuff up. Like, you can't just be this wrong this constantly. Like, that has consequences.
Examples of culture and government both screwing up in their own fields, and so both sides do have a point. Stuff like female genital mutilation in Somalia is undeniably disgusting and evil, and government interventions into society like the Soviet Union or Maoist China are also undeniably evil. Examples of this are views on capitalism and abortion. For the left, capitalism is an oppressive structure that lowers people's goodwill towards each other and replaces it with greed. For a right-winger, without capitalism, people would starve since no one would be personally incentivized to work.
Which is preposterous, of course, because, you know, capitalism is relatively recent in our history, and people obviously did not starve because, you know, we're still here. And in fact, there's more of us than ever. Now, granted, there's more of us than ever in large measure because of capitalism, but that's not necessarily a good thing. So we're not looking towards simply maximizing the number of human beings. We're looking to maximizing the quality of their life, which is not to say we're looking to, you know, diminish them in number of human beings. But that just isn't in and of itself an essential good. Now, again, he's not taking the stance of the right-winger ostensibly. He's taking the stance of Jonathan Haidt. He's taking the enlightened centrist stance. The problem is that the enlightened centrist stance is not centrist. It's actually more radically ideological than the right-wing stance, which understands that its position is predicated on specific contingent things, which it needs to brute force in. Like, in that respect, it's a bit more respectable sometimes. The centrist stance is completely unreflective. It's childish. It takes the plethora of positions on the news as if these are representative of the range of actual positions. Like, look, there's Fox News, and there's CNN. There's the lefties, and there's the righties. And that's just how this works. And I realize I'm using my left hand to refer to the righties, which is confusing. But I don't know.
Similarly, left-wingers view abortion as oppressive since it lowers women's abilities to choose if they have
There are tons of left-wingers who are anti-abortion. Tons. And there are tons of right-wingers who are pro-abortion. And for God's sake, if you're a right-wing eugenicist, you have to be pro-abortion.
Children. While right-wingers view women as personally incentivized to abort their children, which they view as morally wrong. This is because in a socially conservative worldview, a woman's main role is to be a mother and a housewife, and so abortion is her shirking her cultural and societal role.
There are left-wingers who think that too, unfortunately.
So far, we've mostly talked about fancy words, although this—
Hang on, I want to look at this bookshelf. There's no way in hell this is his, but I want to see how much of it I have. Hang on, we need to increase the quality. Oh, that's as good as it gets? Okay, what do we got here? What do I have on this shelf? I have that copy of the Phenomenology of Spirit. I don't know what... oh, wait. On the... I don't know what that is. I have that... I actually have that exact copy of Heidegger's Basic Writings. Ooh, I have a gorgeous hardcover of this copy of the Basic Works of Aristotle. Let me grab it for you, actually. I'm proud of this one. So, you can get the lame paperback one for like $40, or you can go to my local used bookstore and get the surplus copy of it, which is in this gorgeous plum case, and it comes like, oh, it's so beautiful. For $20, it's actually cheaper than the paperback. It's kind of amazing. Anyways. Blows my mind. Crappy glued paperback is double the price of the cloth-bound, in the slipcase, sewn copy of the same book. What else have we got here? Is that... I don't know if that's We by... No. That's, I think that's actually the ancient pre-Platonic... what is it? Pre-Socratic philosophers? By... is it Waterbridge? I think it's Waterbridge. And I can't read the rest of these. And Negative Dialectics. We've got the Cambridge editions of Kant. Not a whole lot of Hegel here, considering he has that one. I don't recognize any of these at the bottom. Plato's Republic. I don't like that edition. Anyways, oh, and I think that's Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. All right, enough of this. Let's move forward.
At this point, a significant part of this channel is philosophy. I distrusted philosophy for the longest time, given that it seems so disconnected from real-world evidence that whatever the philosopher's self-interest was just became the main theme. However,
it's very Marxist of him.
There are real-world economic and demographic reasons for the modern division between the right and the left. From game theory studies, we've found that there are three main elements in a society. The free riders will continually try to game the system and cheat in order to win. The angels will continually give into the system, and both of these groups are around 20%. The final 60% are moralists that will either game the system or pay in depending on what everyone else is doing. It's my opinion that the success of a society depends on how it creates incentive structures in order so that people will...
I have no idea where that's from. I've heard those divisions before, at least the top two, but I have no idea where that's from.
...will naturally work with the system or against it. Countries like Sweden or Japan are extremely successful at this, but just look at their crime rates and wealth.
By the way, there's a reason why we have a division in social science now between the global north and the global south. When you look at the map of worldwide corruption, what you're largely looking at is countries that are directly profiting from exploitation in other countries. You're not looking at these good, moral, liberal places where people are just better. You're looking at places that are directly profiting from the corruption elsewhere. So it's not just a matter of class exploitation. There's also class exploitation internationally. And it's really sinister. It was funny, actually. I remember a while ago, I used to work in Walmart while I was taking my undergraduate. And we would have these meetings in the morning where they would like talk about certain things pertinent to your job while you're there. And we had an ethics day. They're telling us that we want to be ethical, we want to not steal time, things like that. We are surrounded by boxes in the meantime, stamped with "Made in Bangladesh." And that very week, a Bangladeshi factory had a fire, and tons of people, I think everybody inside died, because the overseer had locked the doors and left them while they were working in sweltering heat. So that was rich.
And the like. Well, Somalia and Afghanistan are the opposite. Historian Peter Turchin has created algorithms that show historic fluctuations in whether society...
Okay, who is his name? This guy needs to slow down. He can't even pronounce words correctly. I don't want to be mean, but like, good God.
Wealth and the like. Well, Somalia and Afghanistan are the opposite. Historian Peter Turchin has created algorithms that show...
I don't know who Peter Turchin is. I assume he said Peter Turchin. There's no... Is there, Oh, did I zoom? If I zoom in, does that make that, invisible to you guys? Sorry. Yeah, there's no link to sources here.
Historic fluctuations in whether societies are incentivized towards cooperation or tearing themselves apart. From computer models, he's been able to predict when the Russian Revolution or
I'm inaudible. Sorry, I just realized that I had the screen maximized by accident, and that made it so you can only see a corner of the thing. Let me check here. Have I been talking inaudibly for a while? What have I got here? Oh, you haven't caught up yet. All right. Oh, I don't think these are Goodman. I don't think these are his books. I think this is just a picture of a bookshelf.
Roman civil war would occur on the timescales they had occurred at. More horrifyingly, the factors that drove those societies towards disunity are the very same ones we have today. The main factors driving these kinds of disunity are a combination of wage stagnation and elite overcompetition. By that, I mean when normal wages stagnate or decline for whatever reason, there's more competition to get into a wealthier and wealthier elite, which is also getting smaller and smaller.
I mean, there's always elite competition, though, because you're always going to... That's not... Oh my god. Oh my god. Social change is always propelled by elite competition, because only elites have access to military and institutional power. That's why they're elites. This is so meaningless.
This means that there's desperation to get a shrinking amount of good jobs. Whenever this occurs, the elite splits into different factions, whether this was the Armagnacs and Burgundians in medieval France, the Parliamentarians and Royalists in 17th century England, or the Whites and Reds in 20th century Russia. What all these have in common is they represented different social classes inside their societies that wanted power. Something to keep in mind is that both the right and the left are coalitions of different factions more than they are real central forces. The right's a coalition of business interests who tend to be economically...
Hang on, wait a minute. Wait a minute. So they're not religions anymore. Now they're coalitions of real institutional forces. Pick one. Are they religions, or are they coalitions between militarists and the religious and businessmen?
Conservative and socially liberal, followed by religious conservatives who are socially conservative and sometimes economically liberal. Then you have militaristic nationalists who tend to be aggressive in America first, and tend to be moderately economically and socially conservative. On the left, you have broadly three factions. First, you have the big government types that want to use government to promulgate mildly socially and economically liberal policies. Meanwhile, you have the social justice far left that's socially left-wing to a near religious degree, while not really thinking about the economy that much. And finally, you have ethnic minorities that tend to be socially conservative but don't want to be culturally dominated by the majority society.
Yeah, this really... yeah. So this guy's not a racist. You notice how he basically just characterizes ethnics as being sort of a passive reserve of bodies that aren't really... They don't really like any of this, but they're just going along for the ride because they're kind of helpless. Yeah, that's sort of what Frantz Fanon is getting at when he talks in Black Skin, White Masks, that the white man tries to, you know, what is the language? It's the white man wants to be recognized as... I need to find the actual thing. Long story short, though, it's like, it's just something kind of gross about this. It's a coalition between, you know, people with real policy aims, people with real ethical goals, and then there's just ethnic minorities.
In the United States and most of the rest of the Western world, the left is dominated by the educated classes, who will continually...
I'm actually annoyed by this. I want to find that actual quote. Hang on a sec. All right, very good book. You probably would be assisted in understanding it by some like bare bones acquaintance with Hegel, but let's see, where is it? Here we go. Yes. The black man wants to be white. The white man is desperately trying to achieve the rank of man. So you think in terms of Aristotle, of the Athenian citizen aspiring to, or the good citizen rather, aspiring to assembling the virtues and becoming the eudaimon. of flourishing, of being a full human being, whereas the black person in a society that regards black men as inherently inferior and, you know, let alone flourishing, they're considered as beneath white people generally. Granted, we don't generally ubiquitously have those attitudes now, but certainly that was largely the case when Fanon was writing. Here, I should say. What you're aspiring to ultimately is just the recognition as equivalent to the starting point of a member of society that is not prejudiced against. So, good book. Read it. It's very interesting.
Support policies to support members of their social class. Well, on the right, it's the process-driven social classes like businessmen, the military, and the clergy. If you look at left-wing policies, they're all driven by the desire to put people with college degrees in power. Look at social justice, which entails giving...
God forbid we have educated people calling the shots, right? It's really telling when... It's really telling when you're burned against your opponents. These people all just spent time studying what they're talking about. These everybody has college degrees today, including people on the right. Like that's silly. I keep joking about this, but it's kind of true. Like you'll watch people people on Fox News diss a college education constantly. They'll go on and on about how a liberal arts degree or anything in the social sciences or stuff like that, anything, you know, that prepares you specifically to administrate and order and run a society or a government or something like that. That these are wastes of money. These are not degrees that will get you a stable job. They've got like a horrible left-wing bias, things like that. Just go into a trade. Or, you know, just start working, whatever. And then they'll go, why are there only leftist professors? Well, I don't know, genius. Maybe you shouldn't have told all of your children that getting an education in these departments was a waste of time. Maybe there would be more people sympathetic to your concerns if you didn't do that.
Giving professors on topics like gender or racial studies preference over religious groups and ethical questions.
I want to get his wording right. Let me rewind that quickly.
Left-wing policies, they're all driven by the desire to put people with college degrees in power. Look at social justice, which entails giving professors on topics like gender or racial studies preference over religious groups and ethical questions.
Why would you give religious groups preference on ethical questions? Being a part of a religious group or a representative of a religious group doesn't require you to have thought hard about ethics. It doesn't require you to know what's at stake in an ethical stance or in a policy stance driven by ethical concerns. Like the reason why is because it's not in society's best interest for that to be the case, and also they seem to be, for whatever reason, extremely assiduous about not getting any sort of qualification in the areas in which they want to influence. And there's a reason for that, and it's precisely the reason for the skepticism of universities. That when you're educated, you don't like those positions. And it's not because you're indoctrinated. It's quite the opposite. It's because you've actually started to think about it for the first time. And this stuff doesn't make sense. Like, imagine promulgating the idea that just thoughtlessly sticking with what you've been raised to believe is inherently superior to actually thinking. That's terrifying. That's terrifying. That means you can't address any contingency whatsoever. So any contingency that is inscrutable to a kind of layman, a kind of blind lay person's position. Like it's. I mean, I don't even know how to respond to half of this. It's just. I'd like to actually talk to him face to face. Not face to face. He's anonymous, but like I'd love to talk to him on stream about this, because his methodology is just. it's such a mess. It's such a mess. Like, there's... And you can tell, like, he doesn't even watch these things over once he makes it. They're, like, glaring spelling errors, even despite the fact that he's zipping through slides like there's no tomorrow. Alright. There's only a bit left. Let's finish this.
Similarly, given college-educated government bureaucrats' control over the economy through regulations, college-educated diplomats over the military and foreign policy, college-educated social workers over the police and the like, the left-wing view that humanity is inherently perfectible
No. These are super complex institutions and spheres that you need training to be able to engage in effectively. Like, just a rando just by dint of being religious is not therefore equal to a university-educated expert just because they take opposite sides on a position. That would only commend the position of the learned person. At best, what you could say is that the concerns of the other side of that particular contention should be taken into account as a material factor in the analysis of the former. But that other person is by no means, by sheer dint of disagreeing, therefore equally qualified or equally in the right to influence a decision. Like, I'm sorry, there is, in fact, unfortunately, a hierarchical difference to be observed between people who know and people who don't. Why? Because if you don't know, if you haven't taken the efforts to actually understand a field, to actually keep abreast of it and to keep abreast of current events and of the actual stakes, and aren't just like I'm sorry, like, what should we like think about what that entails. That would entail giving equal rights to people who think the world is flat. Like, should people who believe that black people are genetically inferior to white people be allowed to determine police policy just by dint of being religious? I hate responding to videos like this because I feel like I get all like ranty, like you know, you're like your typical political streamer. I don't like that, but like it's just it's baffling. I wonder like where this guy is at education wise. Like, what is he actually trained in? Because yeah, I'm just curious about that, because I don't, you can't seriously study politics and arrive here. Like, you just can't. Anyways,
works very well for the educated classes who believe they've been perfected through education. The open view of humanity that reforms can fix the human condition holds the intellectuals who lead the charge to utopia in a high regard, thus making the view popular with them. The right is based off people who are successful through processes that don't involve education, such as the market, military, and church. The right wants values based off traditionally held Christianity, with wealthy businessmen in charge of policy and the military and police in charge of force. This coalition will support the opposite positions as the left, since it will give them jobs and power as their constituents. It's easy to discount the division between right and left, and many cynical people do that. However, in real terms, these two offer fundamentally different views of the world that lead to fundamentally different results. Their ideal civilizations are quite different, and in their current state, neither one has any real position to compromise with the other, except if that's an existential threat like China. The depressing thing...
What? An existential threat like China. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. An existential so he thinks the right and the left will come together against an existential what does that even mean? An existential threat? Are we in imminent danger of being nuked by China? Oh man. Ugh. I mean, it's. I got nothing. I guess I'll have to watch his Is China the Next World Power at some point, but I've got nothing. I don't even know what to say to this. Like, what does he think China is Mordor? They're just building an army of orcs to sail across the sea and march on... What would Helm's Deep be? The Alamo.
Thing is that in an open and free society, we need both the right and the left, or people who can see what's vital and works inside the status quo, and those who are capable of seeing ways that can be changed.
Exactly. So, so you actually need the super conservative member of the status quo now, who is, of course, the balance between these two sides, which really is to say somebody who wants to maintain the status quo at all costs, because both of these sides want to adjust society in a way that is extreme. And why is it extreme? Because it's against status quo. So again, like, centrism is not centrism. It is radical conservatism. It's just very also radically stupid conservatism.
However, the system we have is in gridlock and not working. Hopefully we can change that. What if Altist, and thanks for watching. If you...
Oh, you're welcome. It's in gridlock and it isn't working. I mean, you've got a bipolar system is stable, right? But I don't see how it's not working. I mean, it's not... Like, what does that even mean, it's not working? Like, has the United States descended into civil war? No. So, clearly something's working. Whether or not it's accomplishing something good is something different, but what does working mean? If he means, is it working towards, you know, achieving a better state of affairs, well, by his language here, that would make him something of a utopian, wouldn't it? Certainly a progressive by definition. I'm going to run to the washroom, then I'll come back and we'll have a final chat about what we just saw. Oh my god. I don't know what default is. I'm just gonna call him Tim from now on. Tim, this isn't it. This isn't how you do this. Alright, I'll be right back. One sec. Okay, so let's do a quick post-mortem on this. So this was doomed from go by damning methodological problems. So obviously, to begin with, he begins with the assumption that there is just a fast and easy distinction that can be made between the right and the left, that these simply operate on a binary, that these represent degrees of distance from a neutral center. And that these distances are, and so from this he associates, because these are deviations from a center on a spectrum, he can associate specific human tendencies that can be represented on a spectrum between these two things. So things like openness versus closedness, you can have degrees of these. Respect for authority, you can have degrees of these, things like that. Or at least you can describe them as in terms of degree. The problem is that, I mean, first of all, there's the factual case that the left and the right, first of all, don't even necessarily hate each other. The right and the left aren't persons. They don't have emotions. They aren't characterized by specific attitudes towards each other necessarily. They're just characterized by an historical opposition, and the historical opposition is largely lost to us. When we talk about right and left, we largely mean, in the context of the United States and in Canada, sides in a bi-party political contention. Yes, a tri-party political contention in Canada, but the Democrats and the Liberals are largely vying for the same, sort of left-wing position as the Conservatives are, and the Democrats have not done particularly well. So it's right. So in that context, it sort of makes sense pragmatically to refer to the right and the left in terms of a division, simply because a binary choice is what is presented to them at election time. Okay, fair enough. The problem, however, is he's trying to make this something deeper. He's trying to do an anthropology based on these divisions. And the fact of the matter is that right and left have no meaning outside of a very narrow set of historical contexts. Even conservative. Conservative doesn't refer to an attitude against the left. It refers to an attitude against change in very broad terms. At least we're not talking about, like, well, I mean, yeah, even when you're talking about Burke, for instance, he had a series of, he had prejudices against the revolution in France, which at that point we hadn't had the history of the terror either, that were, I think, unfair and unfounded and classist. However, what it represented ultimately was an attitude of wanting to hold on to what we've gained, right? And that can be classist in nature. In fact, it almost always is. But it can also be respectable in the sense that there are, in fact, hard-won cultural gains that can indeed be lost. Like, and this goes as well for things on the left, like desegregation, the success of the civil rights movement, equal rights between the sexes, things like that. Fostering attitudes of acceptance towards people of non-heteronormative or non-cis people, things of that sort. Like, these are things that can be lost. These are things that you can fight to conserve, and insofar as you are doing so, insofar as these are things that exist that you are attempting to preserve, you are a conservative in that more real sense, than opposed to like a capital C conservative being a member of the Conservative Party, which is conserving practically nothing, almost definitionally now. Yeah. He's taking the stance that the divisions that we see today, and the attitude specifically that he sees in his limited experience as embodying these different positions, he's seeing these as natural and culturally transcendent and historically transcendent. These are things that are just always with us throughout all time. And they're not. They're just not. The state of affairs in which those things take place, in which those things, are instantiated, which those attitudes are instantiated, is very recent and dependent on very recent productive and material forces. Material and productive forces. I guess productive forces are material forces. Very specific material forces that are, again, historically recent. And ultimately, he adopts the stance, not cynically, I think he does this earnestly, and not necessarily in his own interest, except to the extent that he wants to produce content very quickly because he's rewarded for it. he takes the stance of the most powerful kind of ideologue, or I should rather say of the most intense sort of ideologue, in that he takes the very particular and contingent positions that he prefers as being so natural that they disappear as positive or negative propositions. Because the position of the centrist is not simply a balance between two sides, but is the absolute negation of both, because it regards them as two sides. It's what's the word? God, why is my language just escaping me today? I must be so tired. It puts the particular concerns of political actors with real goals, real particular goals, with real and reason to plans for improving the human condition, and it places them underfoot. These are defective variants of me, and I and my presumptions, these are the most accurate reflection of the world, because by being able, of course, to look to the left and the right and evaluate these as being in some sense extreme or deficient, I imply that I myself contain the balance between the two. I have the right position. And it just so happens that the right position is the status quo. It is, of course, the situation that produced these antagonistic sides. So it's thoroughly conservative. He also didn't like the American Revolution. That's kind of weird. I mean, there are things not to like about the American Revolution, but that was really bad. That was really bad. Okay. Yeah, this was just, yeah, okay. Yeah, good point. Good point, Pippa. Right and left really coming together over COVID. You know, like an actual serious global threat. No. All right. Well, anyways, that was awful. If What If Altis would like to chat and defend this, my door is always open. I don't care where. It can be on your channel. It can be on mine. Either or. I don't think he will, but, you know, there's the offer. This was probably the worst political video I've ever watched. This makes the distributors look like Mensa material. This was an absolute travesty. Alright, well, hey, in brighter news, Infrared and Perspective Philosophy are going to go at it again this Saturday. Oh joy. Take care.